joining this. This is the Xoogler community session to help people know what should be in today's resumes. Just had to switch to this new format as we had sent out an incorrect link. So thanks again, Eitan, who works in recruiting and applied intuition, to share more about what should be in today's resumes. I sent out an agenda already, and I think we are ready to go. So Eitan, I'm asking you to start video. That should be fine. And also make you a co-host so you can share your screen a bit later. Yeah.
All right, we should be live.
So that we can get right into this, would you mind doing a quick 30-second introduction of who you are and also what's applied intuition? Thank you.
Yes, I'm a recruiter for over a decade now. Started my career in staffing agencies, spent a good part of my career at Google, and today I lead the staffing function at Applied Intuition, later stage hyper-growth company, Series D, $3.65 billion valuation company that's operating in the automotive, defense, as well as the autonomy domain as a software supplier, software partner to industries that are seeing platform shifts. Going from hardware, mechanical to software. Today, I lead a 20-some person team here at Applied Intuition and help with all things recruiting as well as people operations. And we're hiring globally in all of our offices. We hire heavily out of Google. The company is almost over 50% ex-Google. So a majority, almost of the company is ex-Google. And that's intentional, given that we're a software company and want people who have learned how to operate in the best software company in the world. So I recognize many of you were laid off, and just know that there are a lot of opportunities out there for people just like you, including here at Applied Intuition.
Thank you, Eitan. And Casa, the CEO, co-founder of Applied Intuition, had helped me when I was leaving Google in 2015. At that time, he was the chief operating officer of Y Combinator, and opened up his doors to help me as a early stage founder back then. And I know him and his whole team would love to be able to help all of you where possible, whether it's hiring directly into Applied, making recommendations, sharing more of your profile. So thanks, Eitan, for going through some of these questions and these topics today. So I've enabled the chat as well as the live Q&A. So if you go to the bottom bar, you're able to start clicking on the screen and we can sort of get started from there. So the first topic we're going to discuss is really what should today's resume look like? Can you share more about perhaps even what resumes today should look like, but how does it compare to a few years? You've been working in the industry for quite a while.
Sure. So I think there are a couple of really useful resources online that talk about the basic framework that you should look at when you're creating a resume. And I don't want to spend too much time on that because this stuff is widely available. Instead, I'm going to link probably my favorite two articles here on this Zoom. They're written by Laszlo Bach, who I think many of you know is the long time, especially early days, people leader at Google. And he does a really good job of talking about some of the most common mistakes that people have when they create resumes and what are the winning formulas in his mind for putting a resume together. So encourage all of you to review these separately. And I'm not going to talk about the more obvious stuff here, like formatting, typos, grammar, so on and so forth, because I think there's just a lot available on this line. So I'm going to talk about the things that I think are just high signal that you don't really see too much online and kind of traditional self-help forums. And this is all just me sharing my perspective as a professional whose job has been for over a decade just looking at resumes and getting very, very good at looking at a resume quickly and recognizing if this is someone that we should engage with as a company or not. And I'm intentionally going to say some things that could sometimes also be maybe conceived as slightly controversial, but there's sort of some hidden truths in how the world of resume screening works. So I think the first thing that is relevant to all of you is that maybe most of you is that you've worked at Google, and Google has a powerful brand. My number one rule is that you want to emphasize any strong brand that you have that you think employers can immediately latch onto as almost an easy filtration mechanism for them to have when they're trying to decide if they want to spend more time on your resume versus move on to the next resume, given that A lot of these employers are looking at dozens or hundreds of applicants a day, especially in today's market. Brands for me mean, to go to some tactical examples, are really a number of things. Number one, especially if you're early career, but just generally speaking, if you went to a widely known and a respected school, then I would put education on top because that's going to catch the eye immediately. If you worked at Google or really any other top company, Meta, Amazon, I mean, these companies have such strong hiring brand that people already associate excellence with when they see that brand. So if you worked at Google, I would make sure that your resume is Google forward, and that the first thing that a recruiter can do in their first 5 seconds looking at the resume is they see Google and they decide to spend more time reviewing the entire resume. If you are early career and you had some interesting experiences in academia, maybe exceptional performance on standardized tests, different clubs you were involved in, I would put that on the top and make it really noticeable. Broadly speaking, if you have a high GPA or anything like that that's exceptional, I will put that on top. So the main thing is emphasize something that you think is really exceptional when you look at your own background that you don't commonly see on other resumes. Generally, employers use these exceptional indicators as a high signal to noise filtration mechanism to know that you are a candidate or that probably has done something really impressive that has the capacity to likely do that again at the company that they're interviewing you for. The next thing that the recruiter eye normally goes through when they look at resumes is either very short employments or very big employment gaps. And while the first 5 seconds go to reviewing reputable brands on the resume that tell you the person has seen excellence somewhere, the next 10 seconds go into seeing how this candidate took advantage of that opportunity over time. If you have, for any reason, multiple short employments, which is a very normal thing. For example, many people have had a lot of contracting jobs in their career and consulting jobs in their career, or maybe have been unlucky to be in organizations that were sunsetted or companies that shut down. And it's just a natural thing that happens. Make sure that the employer has a very easy way of understanding what happened that led to that short employment or to that career gap. You shouldn't feel afraid to add that to the resume unless it's something that's very personal that you feel uncomfortable with sharing with an employer. I think that generally speaking, every resume has some leeway with probably one short employment stint, but employers are naturally wary of resumes that show multiple short stints. So if you happen to have those, think about the reasons and make sure they're listed. The reason for why employers are worried about this is that generally a short employment stint, so anywhere from, I would say, 6 months to a year and a half or so, tends to be associated with a poor performance outcome. Like the first 6 months, that person is doing onboarding, getting settled. Next 6 months, they're sort of realizing it's not for them. Maybe they're not performing. At that point, the 1 year mark, the employer realizes this person's not really performing, and you start going through various different types of performance improvement motions. And eventually 6 months later, they get cycled out of the business in about a year and a half. And that is a pattern that employers are exceptionally aware of. So if you have something like that on the resume, make sure that the storytelling you're doing around that is done in a way that the employer feels comfortable that this was not necessarily a performance matter, or even if it was a performance matter, there's not a repeating trend. The second part of this is oftentimes employers think that if you've had multiple short employments over and over and over again, you've sort of built the muscle at that point of getting comfortable leaving jobs when something gets uncomfortable about a year to year and a half into the job, which is a very common thing that every job always has some struggles. And employers want to see some signal that you can work through those, weather the storm and come out better at the 2.5, 3 year mark. Whereas if someone has had this pattern of constantly getting out of jobs, then for them it's basically normal. And whenever something bad happens at this new job, it's more likely that they'll think, okay, well, this is kind of normally when I leave, which is also a very scary thing to employers, because short employments are very expensive for the employer. There are just a lot of monetary and just time costs that go into recruiting you, into training you, offboarding and backfilling you. This is one of the main reasons for why employers are hypersensitive to this. So the summary is that if you have any short employments, then your resume needs to do a very good job of quelling any of the worries that employers might have. So if it's a layoff, explain that it was a layoff and that you were affected, especially if it's a non-performance related layoff, like the entire business unit got shut down or something like that, then I would really make sure that the employer can see that on the resume. If it was a contract or a consulting gig, make sure that it's there. If you saw the writing on the wall for a flawed business and made the decision to leave before the whole thing comes crashing down, add that too. That's a good signal that you're able to recognize it's not a good company, and you just didn't really spend the extra time kind of going through the collapse with the business. Lastly, life happens sometimes, especially personal life. And when that happens, it's okay and completely understandable if the person that's reading the resume can actually see that happened and make sense of it. So when things in personal life or other circumstances cause short employments or gaps, just include that there so that the employer doesn't have to do their own game of guessing to figure out what happened.
Thanks, Eitan. Why don't we go to some of the questions that have been submitted? And I think that have some clarification thoughts on what you had just shared. That's super useful already. Thank you. So the first one is about what do you define as short? And I guess I'll wrap it into how should people here sort of include the RIF, the RIF that just happened?
So a short generally is anything under 2 years. And there is really, really short, which is under 6 months. That is oftentimes less concerning to the employer because it's just very clear that it was in and out attrition. Something just wasn't right and it was remedied. If it's a year to year and a half, that's normally the concerning pattern of short, which could mean performance or something else that just didn't work out. And the candidate either or the employee either did not stick through with it, or the employer did not want the candidate, the employee to stick through with it. Yeah, year to 2 years is roughly what I think of short employments. So let me look at the questions here. Yes, I suggest that you mention your part of the RIF 100%. And I would actually add some color to that as well. So if you were in a business unit that got sunsetted, or if it's like 90% of your team or 80% of your team, or if anything else to show the future employer, the future prospective employer that you were just a part of a very big motion that occurred at Google, rather than it was a very particular decision to single your performance out of the group, which is more of a performance related termination. RIF is reduction in force. I should move away from acronyms. I personally don't like using them for this reason. So sorry for saying RIF. Okay, speaking a lot about short employment breaks between jobs, curious to see long tenured employees in one company as a negative. Long tenured employees at one company could be a negative to some companies, could be a very strong positive to other companies. And it really depends on the company that you're applying for. Generally, if you have been at Google for a very long time, at that point, you've sort of been, every person I think is malleable over the career, and the environment that you're in really molds you into the type of operator that you are. When you spend a very long time at Google, you start to get very good at things that people do at Google, which tend to be very relevant to bigger companies, especially on the kind of hyper big company level, 50,000 people and up. That is a very relevant skill for many employers internationally. However, there are also other employers in a different category, which generally is smaller startups, where the type of skills you need to have as an operator are actually fundamentally different from the skills you pick up to be successful at Google over time. Sometimes when startups see people who have spent many, many years at Google, to them that's a signal that if this person succeeded there and was happy there and was just kind of refining their Google skill, their skills that they picked up in the past, X amount of years are probably less relevant to the type of skills that they need to operate in the stage of the business that the company is in today. If it's a relatively small company, this is not necessarily black or white. There is a lot of gray space there, but that's how I would generally bucket it. So I personally don't think that it's negative when someone spent 10 plus years. That's not something that we think at Applied, but I know that it is very common among some startups to be a bit wary when they see, a very long tenure at one big company, because it just tells you that that person has essentially become that company and how they operate. But for big companies, that's actually a very strong positive, where they want to see loyalty, progression, and the ability to operate in a system that you only have to deal with when you work at these very big machines that have a lot of subsystems that make the company succeed.
Great. So why don't we go actually to some of the larger topics first, Eitan, and then we can come back to the questions, because I think we want to make sure we cover everything that we've set aside.
Yeah.
So which a few people have asked is how they should position their Google position, but also the experience, which is very different, the internal resume to the external resume. Can you share more about how they should be positioning their experience there, or is it a big difference, or what have you seen since you've actually seen a lot of Google resumes that come into Applied Intuition?
Yeah, the one bit of advice that's a bit more generic, but it's also tied to this, is I would say go against the most common advice that you see online with using action-oriented words and language that I deem to be corporate, and instead use very colloquial language. The reviewer who sees a resume should not be confused about what you do. And I think this is especially true for people who worked at Google, where there are so many acronyms, and there are so many, kind of googly ways of referring to a business unit or to a line of work or to a project that if you're at Google for a long time, it makes sense to you, and it probably carries some weight. It's reputable and is recognizable, but outside of Google, most of the world doesn't recognize it. And if anything, when they see it, they could be a bit turned off, thinking that this person has been at Google for a long time, that they've almost become corporatized by Google, which is not necessarily bad. And it just is a difference in how you operate between some bigger companies and smaller companies. So this really depends on what kind of companies you want to apply for, and how you're thinking about your search moving forward. But generally speaking, I would say use colloquial language. The most easly understood words, avoid sort of the nonsensical jargon that you tend to see when resumes are uber professional to the point that they don't make sense. Like, a good rule for me is that a teenager should be able to look at your resume and make sense of what it is that you did, especially in a commercial line of work where you're not building technical things. Someone who hasn't worked professionally doesn't need to try to figure out professional speak to understand what you did. And I think one thing that Google does get people to think about that's actually very good is to focus on the quantitative over the qualitative. This is, I think, very important for resumes. So as you're putting your resume together and translating your experience from Google externally, make sure you focus on the quantitative, but make sure that quantitative is digestible and widely understood. It's not Google specific. So how could you as a Google then think about translating your skills and your experience and your position in Google to the outside world in a way that's digestible by everyone else? A few things that come to mind. Number one, perf. Google talks a lot about perf, for better or worse. I know some people are a bit traumatized by it. I sure was one of them. But if your perf was good, people respect that, and people generally understand what that means. So if you feel comfortable showing your perf, I would actually add that to your resume. And oftentimes that sends more signal than talking about what you did. I think, especially with the layoffs, there is some sentiment across the industry that sometimes the layoffs are more performance related. And this is the easiest way for you to show employers that it wasn't a performance related layoff. It was another sort of reduction in force, an exercise of cost cutting. So if you feel comfortable putting your performance scores, I would put them on your resume. The second thing is in a really digestible way, I would explain the product area that you worked on, and how it fits into the company's business model. So at Google, for example, like NBU, next billion users, doesn't really mean anything to anyone outside of Google. So you need to be able to give it meaning with how you're telling the story about what NBU was strategically for the business, if you worked at NBU, for example, and then what your role was within that ideally affected the bottom line directly. As you're talking about the role, explain your Google role in a way that fits into the role that you're applying for. Avoid big company terms that don't really translate to anything outside, like, for example, strategy. I see a lot of, strategy on resumes, and it doesn't really mean anything unless you actually understand what the strategy was. So basically explain, instead of strategy, what it is that you actually did, and how will that be similar to the work that you'll be doing at the new employer. I think that Google's brand is phenomenal in most ways, but there are other ways in which the brand is not necessarily attractive to employers, and this is especially in today's market, where you're seeing this compression that's really focusing employers within companies on output. There has been a very long time this misconception, or sometimes actually true, kind of a culture of rest and vest, and perks and sort of an easy place to work. And that's been picked up by the media and amplified. I think in today's market, there are a lot of companies that are highly they were just basically really worried about benching talent just for the sake of choking out competition or anything like that. So they want to see that you can come into the company and still work hard, which sometimes there's a misconception that people at Google don't really work hard. So keep in mind that with the Google brand, there's a lot that good that comes with it, but sometimes people will think, this person was at Google for a while, I wonder if they can actually, work hard. So this is where I would actually show that you did not participate in the sort of rest and vest culture that tends to be stigmatized. Easy ways, actually write how your work impacted the bottom line of the business or the product area that you're in. Show that you did not participate in a lot of the kind of the theater of work of doing projects just for the sake of a performance rating, and that project did not actually have an impact at all on the company or on the performance of the team. So I would focus more on the things that actually impacted the business rather than projects just for the sake of projects that tend to impact perf in a way that is only really possible at big companies. Emphasize any sprints you did at your time there, and other sort of moments of high output in the face of very tough deadlines. Those are very good signals for an employer in today's market to realize that just the good in Google is there without some of the bad misconceptions.
No, thank you. So some clarification questions is, should peer spot bonuses be mentioned in resumes?
If you think they are for something that actually impacted the bottom line of the business, I would say yes. If you think it is for something that is in that category of sort of theater work, which is, projects that look good for a perf rating or something, but don't actually make an impact on the company, I would not include that.
And someone asked, they were at Google for 13 years. How far back should they have their perf scores in?
13 years is a long time, but generally, if you've been in Google for 13 years, I would focus more on showing trajectory. That in itself will tell the story of performance. And maybe the past 4 years of perf would be good.
Sure. And what's the ideal length of the resume? Is 2 pages too long?
Strong preference is 1 page, but it doesn't have to be. I mean, I've seen people who have just a tremendous resume of just many years of experience, and you just need 2 pages to show that. But just know that most people only focus on the first page. So I would really focus on 1-page resume if you can.
And very specific question regarding the formats. Do we show that in our resume example, April 2022 to January 2023, or April 2022 to present? If they were laid off, how should they be indicating the time where they've worked at Google for less than a year?
I would, so if you're applying for a job right now, and you were just laid off, it's okay to keep it present. Once you start going to the point of it's been a month or 2 months, then I would actually have the end date. And then I would have some subtext over there, impact by company-wide layoff. My particular team was affected this way. And I was, unfortunately impacted as a result of that. My performance scores, trajectory of Google is what I did.
So unfortunately, when folks were laid off, they didn't have access to any of their performance reviews. Any thoughts on how to message that if they want to feature it but can't have access?
So you can just summarize it. It doesn't have to be the kind of copy paste from the, I don't remember the internal tool is called anymore, but I would just summarize what the perf was. So generally, if you're a strong performer, then I would just mention consistently hit or exceeded performance expectations. For my time at Google, these quarters especially were strongly exceeds or superb if you had very strong performance quarters.
And if you went through a long time without being promoted, but you got very close, how do you show trajectory?
So this is where I would focus mostly on impact. I actually think that going through a long time at Google and not getting promoted is not a negative sign, because to get promoted, oftentimes you have to participate in some of that theater that does not necessarily directly impact the bottom line of the business. So if you went through, if you've been at Google for a while and did not promote, I would just show the work that you did that actually impacted the bottom line somehow of whatever business unit that you're in. And explain why that was very strong performance, like why that was categorized as high performance.
Mm-hmm. When I see resumes, sometimes I do enjoy seeing the quantitative data, but then also I'm curious how this candidate may actually put down such confidential information. So with a question here specifically about that, how should they show the impact but not show confidential information?
Yeah, that's a hard question. So if you can't show impact in a quantitative way because you're constrained by what's confidential, then I would actually focus more on the qualitative and specifically explain in a colloquial way what you did in 1 or 2 sentences. You asked me to show some resumes. I have, if I can present here. Yep. Let me see if it'll allow me to share screen. Let's go. Okay, can you allow me in maybe through my laptop? Just want to make sure that I think the corporate machine here does not work.
Sure. Or I can maybe ping that in the chat and I can screen share that myself if that's easier.
Okay, yeah, that works. So we can do that. So here are 3 resumes that I think do a good job of explaining what people did without getting into quantitative. And these are publicly available resumes, by the way. So I just did a quick search. So nothing confidential.
And for those who aren't on the chat yet, definitely look at the chat. There's some good questions and support people are providing everyone. So
yeah, so Chris, if you can pull these up one by one.
I will pull up the first one right now. It's
we can probably just go through 2. We don't need to go through the rest, actually. Fine. So this is an engineering, it's an engineering resume, but what I like about this is that it talks about the work, especially the work at Google, in a way that is non-corporate and shows impact without focusing on a lot of the quantitative stuff that you can't publish because it's confidential. These are all impressive things. Like this person, so I'm looking at the Google experience specifically, creating a system that Larry and Sergey presented to the entire company, selected for an intern feature on the blog, did this thing, whatever it is that they did here is it's unique, and it just tells me that this person actually made some impact. Now, this is an intern resume, so I'm not saying this is what a resume needs to look like, but I want to show this one specifically because of how it's written. It's written in a way that is digestible and makes sense to someone who is not living in this particular team, doing this particular work. The next resume is a designer resume. If you can go to it.
So I'll just open it up via going to chat. In the meantime, can you answer the question regarding the years of experience? Some people are perhaps worried that the years of experience will be seen negatively, and how to best display the resumes in that fashion.
So I don't think that years of experience are seen negatively. What I would do if you are worried about showing a long career that you don't think is relatable to the work that you're applying for is I would have sort of miscellaneous jobs as an initial part of your resume that could be X amount of years, 8, 10, 15, whatever that might be. If you don't think that your resume tells a linear path, a linear story that takes you to the role that you're applying for. And then the last 5 years could be something that's very relevant to the role. However, if you feel like your career, if you look at the last 20 years, has been very linear in a way that makes sense, that tells a story to the reader, then I actually think include all of the 20 years. It shows depth of experience that you just need 20 years to acquire, and employers get very excited about that.
Great. So I've got the next resume up.
So this is a design resume, and I'm not a designer, but I can read this and understand what this person did. So by the way, this is, again, I don't want to focus too much on the structure of the resume and the page and what it looks like. There are 2 articles I shared earlier in the chat by Laszlo that I think do a really good job of talking about how to build a resume. But what I like about this resume is the language. If I'm someone that's brand new to the industry in a function that has nothing to do with design and UX, I can look at this and get a good sense of what this person did. And then if I'm a professional who has been in design for a long time, I can look at what this person did and understand that. I basically understand all the work that goes into that without this person having to lay out line by line different meetings they attended and so on and so forth. Creating the visual design language for YouTube products, the design development for motion stills, building tools to adjust animations directly on Android apps. If I'm in the space, I know what is everything that goes into that. And it's a very clean way for me to show my work without focusing on some of the very obvious sort of filler that people tend to add to resumes that is not really necessary. So yeah, that kind of brings me to the second consideration that I have when I think about things to not add to the resumes, and we'll get into that topic separately here in a bit. But I think a lot of people tend to just list a lot of basic qualitative work as a filler, like describing very small tasks that if you're someone who is in a space, by association, you could assume that if this person did design on this particular team, on this particular feature, they probably did all that other, all those daily tasks as part of that. And if the perf is good, then you can assume they did all the daily tasks really well without you needing to actually describe them and without having to take on that space, the extra space in the resume.
So for longer tenures, what are your thoughts on breaking down by work done across different teams over the years?
Yeah, I think that could be a very good option. But I would follow that exact same framework for telling a story about something that impacts the business, but in a way that repeats on a smaller scale over and over and over again throughout the resume in 4 or 5 different highlights. So for the past 5 years, you worked in a team that's very different from the previous 5 years. Then the past 5 years tells a story of the impact you had on the business in the role that you're in a really colloquial way, and your performance in that position. And then the previous 5 years is the exact same, and the previous 5 years is the exact same. And the reader can then decide to go all the way from the top to the bottom in a way that makes sense, or from the bottom to the top in a way that makes sense.
So the question I submitted was, I usually had failed startups in parallel to my main employment. Is it better to remove them to reduce the clutter, or is it okay to leave them in?
Startup experience is great. It shows that you've experienced environments that are very hard to operate in. So I would include startups. If they're a failed startup, you can just add that into the subtext. This is a failed company. I learned the following things from working at this failed company. it's good to acknowledge that you recognize what were the things that were not good at the company as a result of working there. So yeah, I would definitely include the failed startups, especially if it's something that you started yourself. It just takes a lot of courage and persistence and grit to start something and run with it. And employers recognize that when they see that you've done something like that. So I would definitely include it.
So I have multiple positions in my history that are actually a continuation of the same position at the org I worked for, spun out or was acquired. Do you have suggestions for how to handle that?
Multiple positions in the industry. It goes back to I think you needing to think about what role you're applying for next, and making sure that your resume is telling a story that points directly to that role. So if you've held multiple positions beforehand, I would just have those companies listed, and I would have the role listed if you want to have full transparency on many years of experience. Or alternatively, you can have multiple, so you can have like the initial section in the bottom of the resume that says multiple roles held in these following companies prior to getting into sales or marketing or whatever it might be. And then the rest of the resume focuses on the most recent marketing work they think is most relevant, showing that you performed really well in that job.
This person received a university degree in the 1990s. Should they exclude it, or how do they avoid looking older?
I don't think that should be excluded. I would add that. If this goes back to my rule on the degree, if you think the degree is something that the employer will be excited about, then I would emphasize it. Make sure that's the first thing that the eye sees. If you think the degree does not really matter as much, then you can put it all the way in the bottom of the resume and focus on amplifying things that the employer will get excited about, because it's clearly stuff that you did that's just exceptional. That, you know, if you look at the broader candidate pool, you are an exception because you have that on your resume.
Eitan, we've got a couple more questions to go through, but I want to make sure you covered everything regarding what you've seen as the biggest and most common mistakes and what you really like seeing in resumes. Anything along those lines that you want to make sure we cover here?
I think I touched on most of it. I'll just do a quick fire line summary on this. Number one, biggest mistake is corporate jargon. I think there's a lot of bad advice online to start every line item with action words and, you know, these different ways to make yourself seem more professional, and it just alienates you, and the reader doesn't understand what you did, or sometimes the reader just takes that as a negative signal that this person is they're talking in a way that people don't really talk in day to day. So basically use colloquial language, avoid corporate jargon. Number two, avoid fillers just to show different tasks that you did. Focus instead on adding work that directly impacted the bottom line and showing that you performed really well in that work. And this allows you to avoid a lot of that qualitative stuff that doesn't really matter, or just small tasks like attended this meeting or did this thing that, you know, wrote emails, like things that people obviously assume you did really well if you performed really well in the role that you had. I think another thing is listing different types of experiences without telling a linear story. Everything that you did made sense to you at the time that you did it. So explain it on the resume in a way that will make sense to the other reader that's reviewing the resume. So if 15 years ago, 20 years ago, you took on a role because of the time, you know, there was something about that was very exciting, either the role, the industry, in your personal life, then I would add that. That will help give a lot of context and color to something that maybe doesn't really fit into the next 10 years you did or the next 5 years that you did. So make sure that the reader of your resume can understand your life story, your career story through whatever it is that you put in the resume. And if it's not obvious to, you know, a teenager reading your resume who doesn't know you, then make it obvious by adding some more context to especially any roles that are outside of that linear progression. I think there are a lot of missed opportunities where people have the ability to show something that's exceptional about them. Like every person is great at something, so show what you're great at. Some of these are very common signals like GPAs, good companies, good schools, exams, personal life accomplishments, Ironman type things, military experience, things that are very hard to do. Starting a company, make sure that those are clear and the eye can see that. So they're placed in a way in the resume that the eye is immediately drawn to them. I think there are just a lot of people that you talk to them after you get the resume, and then you realize, oh wow, this person did something really exceptional. I actually didn't know that before this conversation, and it just makes me think how many other reviewers of the resume did not know that and just passed. And I think one more bit of advice is every company has values, and most of the time these values are publicly available. So if you're applying for a job at a particular company and you know that you really want to work at that company, look at the values ahead of time and ask yourself, how can I make my resume look like it already matches the values of the company that I'm applying for? And this is a very good exercise of thinking about your work and the way that you operated in these different jobs in a way that you think actually does fit in really well with this company that you're going to. And what's going to happen then is that the reviewer of the resume will look at your resume and think, oh, wow, this person seems to really operate in the way that we operate here. They talk about their work in a way that's similar to how we talk about our work here, which makes it more likely they'll double click in.
So we have questions on both the early career side, but also the more experienced side. For the early career side, the questions are around, should it include their projects and experience before they actually started work, and how to best to present that? And then for the people who are a bit more tenured, they're a bit worried about how putting a lot of the experience on may actually leave them out of the consideration set. Do you have any thoughts on both?
Yeah, so I think the answer, I think, is the same for both. If you think that the experience is exceptional and will make the reader think that you've done something that is the exception from every other resume they're seeing, then it needs to be in your resume. This is early career. Like, for example, you did something at school, like you were a TA, you're a participant in some clubs that are really unique. You have a publication or a PhD or on something that's really unique. Make sure that's there. If you don't think it's exceptional, no need to add it. That's where it becomes fluff. And if anything, if it's not an exceptional thing, employers will read it and be like, this is pretty standard. Why is it on a resume? You know, it just tells me this person did not do exceptional things. So that's very true also for people who have had a long career. Listing stuff just for the sake of listing it because you did it may not necessarily make you a better candidate for that role, as in the employer may not necessarily care that you did that work in the past. So an easy way for you to kind of have this almost like your own filtration system to understand if this is work that you want to go in your resume is to ask yourself, is the reader of this resume going to look at this and think that it is an exceptional experience relative to everyone else that's applying for this job in a way that maybe I'm proud of? Like, I looked at this resume that I put together and wow, like the things I listed are actually really unique. If that's not the case, no need to list them because it just becomes just a lot of noise, and people will treat it as noise.
Yeah. So the question that I'll round it up with, and for those who submit a lot of your questions, they're all very important. I'll try to get them answered by tomorrow's speaker. We have another session around optimizing your resume by job scan. I know Eitan won't be able to answer everyone's questions directly as well. So the question was, if you are part of a protected class, should you avoid or not avoid indicating that on your resume? For example, this person was part of XYZ ERG.
Yeah, I think employee resource groups are great. If you think the work you did there was material, I would definitely add it. If you're thinking about adding it just to show that you were a part of a protected class, I would not do that. This goes back into my previous point about theater, where employers are hypersensitive of things added to the resume that don't actually directly impact the business or directly impact the culture of the company, that employees spend more time on instead of focusing on the things that the employer wants to hire you to do, which generally is help the company perform, build products, sell products, or do whatever it might be.
Great. Eitan, if you don't mind, I'm going to go a couple of minutes over because I want to make sure that the audience also gets to hear about the openings that your company has. I did let people know you have over 100 job openings. Can you share more about the best way to apply, what kind of roles are opened, and how to optimize the chances of perhaps getting an interview or a call from you?
Yeah, so I lead recruiting here. Feel free to message me directly if you want to talk about jobs that applied. My email is firstname@applied.co.co, so aton@applied.co. I pride myself in being responsive and timely. So if you message me, I'm happy to talk separately offline. The traditional path is apply through our website. All of our job postings online are active. We don't have anything posted that we're not actively hiring for. So those are hundreds of roles that are open today internationally that we're hiring for aggressively. And I think I mentioned this earlier in the conversation. We intentionally focus on hiring people out of Google. That's a core part of why this business has been successful. Operating in industries are just not really used to seeing good products coming out of Silicon Valley. And that's been a competitive edge. And generally, people who work at Google know how to fit into that. So if you work at Google, that's immediately a very strong signal for us. And yes, we'll just apply online or feel free to email me directly.
And is
I
it
think
better, or is your website better for people to look at the jobs, or which is the better link to look at?
Yeah, so applied.co is our website, and I'll just click on the careers page over there. All the jobs are public. And I can link it here if others are curious. And I think earlier in the call, I also mentioned that there were 2 links from Laszlo Bach on the common mistakes on resumes and the formula for putting resumes together. To me, that's like the basic, resume one-on-one. I think I linked them here, but someone mentioned that they didn't see them, Chris. So if maybe you want to.
Yeah, we repasted. We'll make sure we also resend those links out to everyone.
Fantastic. And that's the basic, one-on-one. So you start there, and then the advice I'm giving is the stuff that you just don't really see online. That is kind of the hidden truth of how these companies are reviewing your resumes.
I guess a quick question for specifically what you just shared. Are all the jobs on site only, or what's your remote work policy?
We work in office in our all of our global offices. So all of our jobs are within radius of our global offices. There are rare exceptions here and there for positions that we just know the person doesn't need to be in the office. But we found that being in office has helped us really operate at a level that's just a level of efficiency and success that we think has essentially been a key to our ability to win so far as a company.
And culturally, how is it similar to Google, and also how is it different to Google working at Applied?
That's a good question. So I don't ride my Google bike to the pancake bar anymore at 10:30. I do miss the blueberry pancakes that are quite good. I encourage everyone to look at our values. I'll put the link over here, and I think these values are good for you to see because they are unique to Apply, but also they are very indicative of the culture of most startups, where the only advantage you have as a smaller company is your ability to move fast, to support customers, so on and so forth. Whereas as a bigger company, your advantage is resources. So the way that we are able to compete as a smaller company is because we rely on our team to operate in a way that you can only do in a smaller company that's not really burdened or constrained by process and systems and meetings and delays and different owners who have multiple different sub-owners underneath them. The values are written in the order in which we prioritize them. Value number 1 is speed. Value number 2 is customer focus, and so on and so forth. This helps us deliver as a company. And when you're reading the values, and this is true for all startups, ask yourself, what are the upsides of these values, which generally means the business is performant, but also what are the downsides of the values? And sometimes it also means that generally at these startups, you tend to work a little bit more. If you're moving really fast, you're doing a call later this afternoon or evening instead of tomorrow at 10 a.m. Because that's the only advantage that you have as a business, to be able to do that for a customer faster than someone else, just a bigger, slower company. So I think values are a very good way for you to get a sense of whether or not the culture of the company that I'm going to be joining is right for me, looking at the pluses, kind of the positives and the values, or the potential downsides, and how they may affect me if I were to work in that culture.
So I mentioned that Applied Tuition is a Series D company. There are some companies a lot of individuals may apply for, maybe earlier stage. Are there specific questions you would recommend them to ask to clarify how stable that company is and how to make sure it is a good place for them to enter?
Yeah, I think this is especially timely given what's happening in the markets today. What you're seeing is this really significant shift in the macro level where free money is no longer being given to companies that are not operating the way that a business traditionally has to operate, which is you're creating more value than the value you're burning. And that brings me to a few core questions I think every person can ask if you're looking at startups specifically. Number one, do you have revenues? If the company doesn't have revenues today, do they have an immediate path to revenues? Getting revenue is a very hard thing to do. Surprisingly hard thing to do that I think a lot of companies don't realize until they actually go through the motion of acquiring and growing revenue. So that's a very good signal if the company already has revenues. The second, to me, is the biggest one. Does the company have profits? That dynamic of actually generating value out of your work and monetary value tells you this company figured something out culturally that is just very hard to figure out and sustain. And if the company is profitable, then that means they've kind of figured out that system for creating more value in the value that they're burning. If the company is not profitable, then ideally they have some clear path to profitability in the near future. The second thing that's tied to this is, the market today, it's not very clear when, more money will come from investors, if at all, anytime soon. So you want a company that ideally is default alive, that's living on its own without needing support from private investor, public investors, whatever it might be. And then the other things I look at are not really monetary signals, but the founders, do they have, does it make sense why these founders are operating in the industry they're operating in? Do they have the experience in that space? Is that founder fit right? The team, is the team impressive? If you're talking to people in the company, you think, wow, these are all very smart people that I would love to work with. That's generally a good signal because that means everyone else in the company saw the same thing and recognize it. Whereas if you're talking to a company and you're realizing, I haven't really been particularly impressed by many of the people I've talked to, and then that's also a signal that I'd keep in mind. And there's other kind of a few layers of who are their investors, what is their backing, what is the industry they're in. That I think you generally tend to see and the common advice of, how to evaluate startups, product market fit, so on and so forth. But yeah, for me, the main things are revenues, profitability, strength of team, and founder market fit.
And so the last question I have is really about how fast should individuals go on their job hunt? They just went through this traumatic experience. The market conditions are unknown. Should they consider consulting, going to full-time job mode right now, hunting mode? What would you advise a lot of people here? How worried should people be regarding, should they take some time off, then job hunt? Should they job hunt immediately? And should they perhaps fill it with some consulting gigs? What advice do you have for individuals here, Eitan?
My advice is really do whatever is right for you in your personal life at this stage. As I think the more I've kind of grown into my career, I realize that the one thing that you can never take for granted is health and happiness and other things that are not directly tied to work. So if you find that this is a unique opportunity for you to give time to life that otherwise would not have happened, I encourage you to do that. From talking to people who have seen many of these sort of zigzag charts in the past, it tends to rebound at some point and the opportunity will be there to find work. If you do know they need work immediately though, then I would dive right in. There's absolutely no reason not to do that. I think the market is still very hot. I mean, there are a lot of companies that are hiring. There is a lot of money sitting with investors in a lot of places looking to deploy into these growth companies. Bigger companies are still growing. Companies are making a lot of money. I recognize Google did the layoffs, but the company is still, extremely well-run, profitable business. So the point is that there's an entire industry that's still very much alive. And if you know that right now you need work, then I would definitely, jump right in and don't be intimidated by the state of the market. It'll be a bit hard to navigate, but if anything, I think the bright side of this is that the economy almost made it easier for people to recognize when a job is actually at a good company. A lot of the companies are maybe struggling, have really shown their true face in today's market, whereas companies are actually doing really well, are just a little bit more obvious today because they're performing in spite of the current conditions of the market, which is just a very good signal that this company actually has something figured out.
Yeah. So maybe the final question I'll pull out from Nicholas is, this question is about, is the market really hot for senior / L5s plus only? Are juniors and mid-levels a bit doomed right now, or what have you seen in the market itself?
Not necessarily. So we just closed our biggest new grad hiring class to date as a company. We just closed the class, so we're no longer hiring junior people. But this year was the biggest hiring year for us for junior people. On my team, even in recruiting, I think we hired 5 new grads directly out of school without any experience. So the point is that I think the market is still very much there for junior people. However, I do recognize that largely speaking, junior people have been impacted more by layoffs. So that market dynamic probably has constrained junior people's ability to find jobs. This, in my opinion, is actually a good opportunity to look at smaller startups that are still hiring and actually kind of being founded right now because of what's happening in the market with so much more talent available. That tends to be a very good option for junior people. There are a couple of really good articles that I actually recommend. Shout out to Mark Andreessen, his guide to career planning blog post is a 4-part blog post. If you're junior and you're entering, I don't know, your first, second, third year in your career in today's market, I encourage you to read that. The second one is Elad Gil, probably the most prolific independent investor today in Silicon Valley. It's a guide to career planning. Encourage you to read that as well. Both of them are available with a quick Google search. And I think that after reading that, you'll realize that maybe this is a good time for you to look at some of the smaller startups that can get you access to really unique networks that I think are being formed today and really good learning opportunities that will help you have a phenomenal career in years to come.
Sorry, I'm going to ask one more submitted question, and I'll ask you the final question is, what other final piece of advice do you have for this community today? So Brittany asked, how would you go through a job search, right? Is it going on LinkedIn? Is it individual company boards? Is it networking job boards like Xooglers? How would you recommend folks here structure the job hunt?
So I think what's good about looking at job boards is it tells you what companies have a lot of hiring activity, which generally is a good signal for the company is doing well. Not necessarily, so you won't necessarily find your particular job posted on LinkedIn, but the truth is that many jobs are not posted ever. I think today at Applied, we even have a few jobs that we haven't even posted yet because they're either brand new or maybe it's a more confidential search that we don't want to publicize. If you find that there's a particular company that's just hiring and you can tell that they're hiring for everything, they likely will want to talk to you as well. And then once you recognize what the company is, I actually encourage you to go on LinkedIn and click around and see who works there. You might find someone who you're connected with directly, or maybe has a second or third degree connection. You can either cold message that person, or you can, better yet, ask someone that's connected to that person to introduce you. Just for an exploratory, introductory conversation, kind of guised under a networking event, that tends to lead to conversations that oftentimes lead to opportunity. So I guess instead of sending your resume to a job listing that probably has a bucket that's just filling up with hundreds and hundreds of resumes every day, I would pay attention to who those companies are that are hiring for anyone today, and hiring especially at a large amount. And then I would do some networking, backdoor networking, or messaging people on LinkedIn cold who work at that company just to talk and network.
Thank you, Eitan, for sharing so much from your insights on the ground, as well as inspiring people who are early in their careers, but also later in their careers, more experienced, so that this community is for you, everyone. We have people like Eitan willing to help you. And so definitely reach out, go on Slack, join the LinkedIn group I mentioned, and we'll have more people like Eitan come talk to you. Hopefully you guys are staying sane and safe during this time. Eitan, any final words before we wrap up?
Thank you for having me. I empathize with all of you who have been affected by these layoffs. Just know that the market is vast. And when you live in Google for a while, you don't recognize how vast it is because you just get so acclimated to Google as a loving home. But once you actually leave that home, you realize there are a lot of other loving and very, very growing homes all over the market. So there's lots of opportunity out there, and I'm excited for all of you to find it in whatever form that means for you.
Thank you so much again, Eitan. And everyone, thanks for joining this. And don't forget to lean on your community. We're here. We were set up to help all of you. So bring all of us on Slack, email me directly if you want your question featured tomorrow's session. And again, good luck in the search. And Eitan, thank you again for sharing so much wisdom today.
Thank you. Thank you all. Thanks, Chris. See ya. Bye.